So we're having a look at chapter 1 and question 5, which has got these wonderful terms, these juicy terms that we like to reference and draw out and talk about. The two that are mentioned here are reprobation and antinomianism, and both are things that the Wesleys accused Calvinists of teaching and promoting. Reprobation, the teaching of reprobation, and the teaching of antinomianism. What's interesting, if you want to delve a little deeper, is you'll find that the Wesleys, and John Wesley especially, often focused on the teaching of reprobation. Whereas later on, when some of the other teachers came along, they talked about antinomianism. So John Fletcher, for instance, wrote his Checks to Antinomianism. And these were big issues in their time, and it helps us to understand a little more of some of the discussion that was going on. Now, perhaps antinomianism is a word that is still current today, more so than reprobation. So just briefly, antinomianism is the teaching that you can be saved by grace, and because you're saved by grace, it doesn't really matter if you go on sinning or not, or maybe it matters, maybe it disfigures your relationship with Christ, but it doesn't change your salvation. Because salvation is simply, purely, only, solely by the choice of God, what you do doesn't impact that decision. God decides that you're saved, and once you're saved, you're always saved. You can't lose it. So it sort of encourages, if it doesn't flat out teach it, it encourages, it makes you lazy about your faith because you can't lose it, because you didn't have to work for it in the first place. And so it's easy to continue with your sinful life. Now, of course, we've just finished saying in question 3, George Whitefield didn't teach that way. So what we can see is that within Calvinism at that day, as you would find it in Reformed theology today, there's a difference of opinion about these things, even within that stream of theology, that whether ongoing willful sin. Mostly, Calvinists don't highlight the difference between unintentional sin and willful sin, so they would say, well, we all go on sinning all the time, which Wesleyans would believe as well, as long as we're only talking about unintentional sin. Willful sin has no place in the life of a believer. So this is the concept of antinomianism. Was Calvinism encouraging people into antinomianism? Of course, they would look back and say Wesleys were encouraging people to try and get saved by good works. So there was push on both sides. The other one that's more interesting, well, I find it more interesting, is this concept of reprobation. Now, reprobation hasn't really survived much in our language, except we do talk about someone who's really corrupt. We say, oh, he's a reprobate. And the concept of reprobation is that there were some people, it's sort of the flip side of the coin to predestination. Predestination says God created all these people, and some of them, before the creation of the world probably, he already determined that these ones would be saved and would go to heaven. Well, the flip side of that is, and all the rest of them, before they were even born, before they even did anything wrong, it was already determined they were going to go and burn in hell. And so that's reprobation. That's that concept that there are some people that God created specifically for the purpose of torturing them forever, which then asks a question about the goodness of God and the fairness of God. And you can see why that topic isn't pursued by Calvinists or by Reformed people today. And even when Wesleyans pursue that topic, we don't yet necessarily use the same terminology that the Wesley brothers would have used way back in the 1700s. The thing that I'd suggest to you on that topic is it leads us into a wider discussion which will come up in several chapters, and that is that fundamentally Wesleyans understand predestination different to Calvinists or to Reformed. Calvinists say, or Reformed people, it's hard for me not to just defer to Calvinists, Reformed teaching says that God decided before you were born whether you would be destined for heaven or destined for destruction. And so there's nothing you can do about that. You can't work to save yourself. You can't become a better person. It's only by the choice of God. And so Wesleyans don't say that, but we know that the teaching of predestination is there. And our strong understanding clearly is that predestination is the pathway to salvation. It is not the person who will be saved. So before the creation of the world, Ephesians says it very clearly, before the creation of the world, God determined this is how it would happen. He decided the pathway. So you would have to become aware of your sin. So the law plays a part in predestination. Once you're aware of your sin, you'd have to be humbled and come and bend your knee before Christ, and then you'd be born again. You'd be forgiven, justified. Then you'd be born again, and then there'd be a pathway of ongoing learning about God's ways until there's a deeper consecration and the filling of the Spirit right through until glorification in heaven. And God decided that despite all of human wisdom and the obvious ways to get someone into heaven, he wouldn't do any of those. He would make salvation by faith. That it would be, he wouldn't be choosing the best people in the world. He'd be choosing the people who had humble hearts. This is predestination. Now, if you understand predestination in those terms, then reprobation is not an issue, because those who aren't saved because of their own decisions, because they had a part in it. They have decided, despite the mercies of God, to reject his wonderful plan. And so reprobation is not a feature of Wesleyan theology. So there's some of the big rocks in the jar as you talk through Wesleyan theology and Reformed theology.